The whole idea of metrics, I don't know, if you go into a conference, especially an agile conference, or heck, pretty much any developer conference, and walk into the bathroom and mention the word metrics, you might get arrested, right? There'll be pitchforks and torches. Those are two words that evoke more anger than dropping, F-bombs in front of a elementary school during pickup time. So, obviously, I don't know, that sounds really bad. So, that's what measures and metrics kind of happen. The reaction is, I would actually say, to some extent, a little bit justified. Justified because, there is a lot that people do with metrics and measures. And sometimes they sound great, but really don't have anything to do with the work that gets done, both at an organizational level and the work that gets done at a team level. And or worse yet, they're used to grade people, or even worse, perhaps that measures and metrics are just uncontrollable, and therefore they're not very motivational, and they really can be demotivation. I know this is a bit of a rant, right? But I think there's another way, and I do believe in metrics. Once upon a time, I worked for Capers Jones, and I believed in metrics then. I'm a much smarter human being than I was then, or well, at least a more experienced human being than I was then. I would suggest that the whole idea of flow metrics are really metrics that do mean something, both to an organization and to individuals. If you look behind me and you see all those books, a big chunk of them are science fiction books. So there will be some science fiction and fantasy sort of use as analogies and metaphors we go through here. But my interest in all of this whole concept of flow metrics, really goes back to exploring in the experiences that I've had over the years that really point out why some organizations, why some groups of people tend to be pointed at and go, oh my, they're doing great work. And there are some things that really, they're really, sort of critical to this. One observation from this all period of time that I used to derive from was that, organizations whose stakeholders held teams or IT groups or organizations in disdain, it really boiled down to that when they had that level of disdain, the teams that were involved rarely had any control over the work that they took on. That it came to them, they had to take it, they did it probably the best they can, because I think everybody strives to do the best they can, but basically they had no control. And therefore, things like throughput and cycle time and flow and work in process, those weren't concepts that they even had a clue about. It really boiled down to a lot of trouble with work entry. Work entry, flow metrics, what's the relationship? Well, again, right? Long time far away ago, I did another one of these wonderful CAI, ITMPI, great IT Pro webinars on something called out of control work entry means no agile for you. And obviously Susan can help us and tell you where to find that. But it boiled down to, so back in November 21, there was a webinar that the premise was that if you don't have control over what's coming to you, then everything else will be out of control. I'm in the middle of writing a book with a gentleman named Jeremy Willits. So, that's sort of foreshadowing. While we're not here to rehash that whole out of control, there are some concepts that fit into the idea of why flow metrics work. So I'd like to at least hit on that just a little bit, right? So what is the idea? So if I'm talking about flow metrics, what is this flow stuff? I mean, here's the problem, right? And we ran into this when we were working on the first couple of chapters of the book, is that the word flow is used. And if you run into an agilist, or you are an agilist, or if you're a project manager, you probably use that word, but I think it's really difficult to actually point to a real definition, something that everyone can sync on. What I'd like to do is actually, for this presentation at least, actually, if you really want, I would suggest this might be the best version of a definition of flow that there is. And, actually, Johanna Rothman pointed it out to me. Flow is the movement and delivery of customer value through a process. So flow is the movement and delivery. So stuff goes through it and it comes out the other end. That's really important. There are some 4 common attributes of flow. This leads to why the metrics, the basic flow metrics that we're going to talk about are important. There's capacity. How much can actually happen? What can you fit in? What makes sense in terms of work in process? The pace. How fast does stuff go through? The variability, because there will always be variability. Early this morning, I was helping a team with sprint planning, and we're talking through how many work items, how many product in this scrum, so product backlog items that they could take into a sprint. Don't do any of that crazy, work on terms of putting effort on it, or counting story points, those sorts of things. We just go directly to the PBIs. But there's always some degree of variability. They break them down, but there's some degree of variability. Variability is okay. We're good with that. The value derived, so all common attributes of flow is that some value is derived by what ends up in the user's lap. All of those things I think are important. So like the Agile Manifesto, right? We have the 4 values and the 12 principles. When we talk about flow, we have a definition and we have 4 common attributes. Those 4 common attributes are radically impacted by the whole idea of work entry. And that's, I think, true regardless of whether or not we're talking about a team, a department, a product, or an organization. What work entry is, just its simple terms, right? We've got to sync on that. How work comes to a team, and whether they decide, the process of deciding whether or not to do it, and what the priority will be. That's work entry. It's funny, Scrum, and while I am not a Scrum fundamentalist, I do use Scrum, it's Kanban, and a lot of other things, but very frankly, the idea of that product owner being that gateway of work coming into the team is sort of a gold standard of what, at a team level, what work entry ought to be. At an organization level, when you're deciding what big pieces of work, the big initiatives to do, somebody has to act in terms of saying, there's only so much resource, money, capital, people, all of those things in this company. Therefore, we can only do this many. That's portfolio management at the organization level. That's work entry, and having a good one, make sure that you do the right things at the right time and don't try to start everything in the whole world. that happens too, right? That happens in real life. I worked with a team relatively recently that felt like they had no control over what they did. They were trying to do Agile. They've been told they had to do Scrum. But every individual on the team, when the phone rang and somebody, some stakeholder called them up, they dropped what they were doing and started something else. The things that got done in the sprint were almost never the ones that they had committed to at the beginning of the sprint. It just was out of control chaos. The person who had been the product owner on that team actually resigned. They actually left the organization because they couldn't sleep at night. It was bad. Why do we care about this? Obviously, the person left. They cared so much that they changed jobs. We care about this because, very frankly, all of this stuff, right? Work comes in, it disrupts other work, creates a scenario where everything else is late. The fact that we're not predictable. And to be honest with you, if I were going to have a tattoo, I was going to have my son-in-law put a tattoo on. He does that for a living. If I was going to do that, I am predictable would be on there, because that's a precursor to being trustworthy. And very frankly, bad work entry, bad lack of control wrecks people. If we, that all scales up to bad stuff happening at the organization level. I mean, none of this stuff, right? None of this stuff is good, right? Initiatives aren't completed. The organization doesn't know when stuff is coming. You can't commit to your clients as to when you will release products. Turnover, higher costs, dogs living with cats, all of that kinds of stuff. Sorry, Ghostbusters over the holidays also. Enough. I know this is a rant on my part. Part of my goal in life at this point is to try to get people to recognize, to control that front end of the process is important. But where did all of this stuff come from? Why is this, the flow metrics piece of it, so critical? Well, it starts with the whole idea of throughput accounting. And the number of participants, just I used the word accounting and people left the building. I'm sorry, but accounting, not a bad word, right? The whole idea of throughput accounting is that we have to understand what goes in, doing value chains or product points of view, what goes in and what comes out. So we have to have an understanding of, just even in the simplest terms, we have to have an accounting. That's what accounting is all about. The idea of the theory of constraints, the goal. If you haven't read The Goal by Eli Goldratt, we're in this business. That's one of the things I think you ought to read. If you don't like reading, business novels, they actually have a graphic novel version somewhere on one of these shelves that I reviewed and read a long time ago. It's actually pretty good. It gets to the point. It tells us what the theory of constraints are. The theory of constraints, basically, for those of you who don't know, is that you identify the constraint. Every process, even Scrum's a process, like from above. All processes have a constraint. You find that constraint, you exploit it. You make sure that it's running as up to 100% capability. Then you make sure that everything else, it's called subordinate everything else to the constraint, so that everything else is running at a pace that keeps that constraint at 100%. And no more, no less, because obviously at that point you're creating waste. And then you work on making, elevating the constraint, making it better, kinds of things. 5 focusing steps. throughput accounting. So books on that topic, and we could go on forever on that, right? Books on that topic include Tame Your Workflow by Steve Kenton, and Seeing Money Clearly by Daniel Doron. And those are really solid, give you a heavy duty, solid understanding of the idea of throughput accounting. In short, for us today, right? For us today, what goes in, what comes out, and we have to understand the relationship between those two. The engine for all of this is flow metrics, and this really is where we get into. I start to be getting into the weeds. There are five-ish at least, six basic flow metrics. I'm going to add one at the end. I lived in Louisiana. I still have family in Louisiana, so I'm a big believer in LAGNIAPPE. So we'll get a little bit at the end, a little extra one to keep things going. But there are six basic, flow metrics that we're going to go through and define and think about. Starting with flow load, flow velocity. There are two books listed on here. I'll be honest with you. These two books, at least for me, were life-changing. Project to Product by Nick Kirsten. Incredible book, incredible amount of information. Again, it takes a very, sort of not macro view, but it is the idea of shifting from a project perspective to a product perspective, value chains, those sorts of things. But the measures in there are incredible. The idea of value chains, value streams, and getting to value stream management or value chain management is incredibly powerful. Commend that book to you. At a team level, sort of blocking and tackling stuff, actionable agile metrics for predictability. I have read that book now about a dozen times. I've read both of those and blogged about them chapter by chapter. Thing I do called Reread Saturday. If you don't want to buy the books until you know what they're about, go over there, take a look at that. There's no URL or no code to trap you in there. So, just go take a look if you like. The ideas in both of them are extremely, synonymous. Both of them have these basic metrics in them. They call them a little different things. So I'll point that out as we go through, but they're the same. You can use this stuff at a big level, sort of a product level. I would suggest that you can also use it equally as effectively at a team level if you can't bite that product vision value chain kind of scenario. You can't bite that bullet yet. One of the critical things here is to measure only real things, never proxies. It's one of the reasons I've stepped away from using things like story points, because they're proxies. They're not tangible things. I've actually also taught classes at sort of fun little classes called, one of them was actually called Lying with Story Points kinds of things. But, that, again, a little bit tongue-in-cheek there. 5 basic things we're going to go through, or 6 basic things we're going to go through them in relatively levels of detail. Are there questions? Have people come up with questions yet? Or there pop open the Q&A? Stop me from, if you don't understand where I'm going with this stuff. Understanding the base is as important as understanding each individual metric. So I don't think there are, but feel free, either in the chat or in the Q&A, I know Susan wants it in the Q&A, so put it there, but if you can't help yourself, the chat is just fine also. But ask, because this stuff actually can change your life, because it is real. So let's start with the idea of flow load. And flow load is a term that's used by Nick Kirsten. I would suggest that in practical application, maybe some purists might disagree with me, but I think in practical application, flow load and work in process, WIP, can be used almost interchangeably. And sometimes I do. I don't necessarily think that's a great idea, but flow load and WIP, equivalent. You pick your guru, pick your vocabulary, come with them. How much work, whether you're an individual, a team, or an organization, how much work is on your plate, whether you're actively working on it, you put it on hold so you can do something else, or you're juggling, the juggling ball is over there. Doesn't matter. What's on your plate impacts darn near everything else. All the rest of the measures that we look at, some of the things that you might think you want to measure directly, it'll affect those too, right? So first step, right, is to get a handle on what you have on your plate. I like the idea in Kirsten in Project, the product, goes through and defines 4 macro categories. You might have a number of different ideas in. Helped relatively recently helped an organization who was using Jira, and they had I think they had 33 different kinds of work items, different kinds of issues, and we boiled that down into 8. And those 8 then map to these 4, so that they could at least get a handle on the kinds of things they were doing. But flow load is what's currently in process. Kirsten would talk about it at a value stream level. Vakante would talk about it more at a team level. It is the single largest predictor of flow velocity and flow time. And I would suggest, putting on my older hat, a quality, because it does have an impact. Again, if you can't know what's on your plate at any one time, if you can't know the flow load, what's done, but what's on your plate, then your work entry process has got to be under control. I would suggest that makes Agile darn near impossible. So if you want to be Agile, you're going to have to get in control, and at least start by knowing what's on your plate. It's sort of a prerequisite. I do sound rather passionate about that. I think so. The second one, so flow load, number 1, and it's first for a reason. Flow velocity. And the word velocity, again, that's one of those passionate words that people use. I'm going to use it in terms of the rate at which we produce things, not the rate that the amount of story points that we do, or the amount of effort in it, or the number of function points. Push all of that stuff aside. Flow velocity is how many flow items you're using. If you're using Scrum parlance, you might call them product backlog items. Everyone has a different set of terms. How many of those you get done in any period of time? You can even call them tickets here. Doesn't matter. I'm not fond of that either. Things, not proxies. For those of you who want a different word for this, and I sometimes don't like the idea of using that term velocity, because of its tie into people's minds in terms of average story points. Throughput is another word for this. So, and that's a solid word. All right. So it's really what's done, what's deliverable kinds of things. You see a chart to the side, it's sort of a weekly flow velocity. It's useful for answering questions about when stuff happens. The load tells us what we have on our plate. Flow velocity or throughput tells us, how much are we delivering over in using periods of time, so that we can then start to talk about when we can release. We can build that into a whole discussion of release plan. But Tom, all of our things are different sizes. Well, that's part of what whatever method that you're using, that you need to start working on refinement. Teams, as a general rule, and there have been a number of studies. There are others in the industry that have looked at this, and it basically boils down to teams tend to break work down when left to their own accord, tend to break things down and get very, or at least relatively consistent. There'll always be some degree of variability. All right, but that's what flow velocity is. It's one of the real big top line flow metrics kind of things. The next one, and this is actually one that when I first started using flow metrics and started helping teams look at their work, this one was actually the hard one, right? And because, especially at that team level, they may not have as much choice in terms of what they can and can't have on their backlog. Albeit many teams now, especially teams that understand that they have to continually work either on themselves, the stuff that comes from a retrospective, or they need to also have some time to retire technical debt, or they end up with a problem. They go through and they understand, I've got 15% in technical debt reduction. That was a team from this morning. But it provides that kind of data at a macro level. If you look up at an organization level, this is one of those flow metrics that, even if you're not wrestling with the idea of product and value chain management, those sorts of things, that it would be useful. You would know whether or not those big ticket items, things that derive features at the lower level, are actually being tackled, or at least effort is being expended in those areas. Might have to do a little deeper dive to know whether any specific thing is being done, but it gives you a handle. In this case, again, going back to the four macro categories that Kirsten talks about, and again, solid kind of thing. In this case, we can tell, that this example, 38% of the work that's being done, right, is focused on features, 25% on risk, 12% on debt. And over time, we look at the flow distribution, we can see that wax and wane. And the idea, right, is that if you look at that over time, if I'm a team or I'm a manager of teams, I can look at that and say, you know what? There are teams that are doing nothing to reduce their overall technical debt. Therefore, there's a distinct potential that we'll start to see the amount of work being applied to things like defects go up over time. And that ends up causing a death spiral, right? The amount of work when you have poor quality, as the amount of work goes up in terms of satisfying and fixing defects, something else has to give. Okay, well, you know what? I can't reduce features this time. I'll reduce, the things like working on risk, and therefore we'll draw down things that perhaps secure us. LastPass got hit the other day. Or we'll stop retiring technical debt. And then that causes even more defects to go up. And suddenly you're doing all defects. And the feature work gets strangled out. Your stakeholders start looking for the pitchforks and torches, and they start looking, right, in terms of what's going on. We can't trust them. They're not delivering what they said they're going to do. So again, flow load, cycle, flow velocity, and flow distribution. And so they all start to lock together in a manner that we then, helps us to understand what's going on. Teams can actually react to this data. If you're whatever framework, whether it's safe in terms of scaling, or DA, or Scrum, Kanban, Scrumban, all of these require planning. Teams can use this data to gate what's the work that's coming in, so that they can also then make sure that they become more predictable and start to retire some of that technical debt, so that the quality goes up, so that they will have more time to actually deliver features. See, these things are all highly intertwined. I haven't mentioned a word time, which is actually next, right? It's the fourth of the big five. And this one, I don't know. Over Christmas, I rewatched The Lord of the Rings. And if you've watched The Lord of the Rings, the movie, you'll remember Gandalf charges back in to Frodo at the beginning of the first movie, after he's gone off and found out that the riders are all moving around, if they're looking for the ring, and he knows the ring is there, and he says, "Is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe?" Well, to be honest with you, the whole idea at the team level is they shouldn't be screaming, wake up in the middle of the night, or having someone shake them. Is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe? It's, are we predictable? Are we predictable? Are we predictable? And flow time is one of those things that allow us to visualize whether or not we're predictable. And what do I mean by flow time? Flow time is a really simple kind of concept. When you start the clock, when does the work begin? Pick up that calendar time, look at it and go, oh yeah, I know what that is. And when is it deliverable? What's the difference between the two? Now, you look on the right-hand side here, right? You can see there are this teams, this is a real team, and this is their data for roughly 12 months worth of data. And lots of things are really big in terms of they take really long, and lots of things are very small. That's the reality, I think, of almost every team's work, right? That it's not this classic normal curve with a few little things and a few really big things and everything right in the middle. It's more of a skewed distribution. Lots of little things and generally some big things. There might be a lot of reasons for that, right? Could be that work doesn't get broken down properly. It might be that once we open it up, we have to wait on somebody else for 8,000 years. in this case, upwards to 100 days, those sorts of things. Again, that's where that variability comes from. That allows us to look at that and say, are we predictable? So, the idea, right? This whole idea of flow time, relatively equivalent to cycle time, and there might be some minor differences depending on how you define that, but it gives you that handle. How variable is the work that we take or are forced to take? If work is pushed, or some combination of pushed in and pulled in, we could probably analyze the difference so that we know and can start anticipating that. But again, this is a really simple one. How long does it take from when you start it to when it's done? And we can look at that. And it will be some degree of variability, but what we look at there is the median. Not the average, but the median. Just because, very frankly, the median tells us, gives us a better handle on what the central tendency in the data is. We can get into a passionate discussion about the difference between average and median. But in essence, the idea here is that we don't want to be influenced by too overly influenced by the things that are far out. And I'm trying not to call them outliers because they're part and parcel of the process. They're part of our capability, part of our capacity. If we take them out, unless there's some really, really good reason to take them out, what we're saying is that we're going to ignore part of our reality. And so median is a significantly better way of looking at that. Flow time. So it gets us time. You might want to call that cycle time. So at that point, right? At that point, we get to a point where I think we've hit the top four. The whole idea of load, throughput, distribution, and time, they're the big four, right? Flow load, just going back to my Lord of the Rings analogy for a second, flow load is that one ring that controls them all. And so if that's true, right? If we know that what we push in or pull in, we take too much, we try to eat a Five Guys hamburger in one bite or 2 bites, that it's going to be painful. Bad things will happen. It will negatively impact velocity. It will negatively impact flow time. It will also, a bit of LAGNIAPPE, I'll do a little foreshadowing here, it will also start to generate neglected WIP. Anything with the word neglected, any phrase with the word neglected in it, probably isn't something that you want, right? So if you can't control work entry, if you can't control the flow load, I'd say you were in deep poop, right? You were in trouble. And it won't get better until you case. The other of the big five. So there are 3 more flow metrics that I'd like to go over in relative detail, right? The first one is flow efficiency. I love this concept. Love this concept. It's cool, right? It's cool. How much time are we actually working on something? How much time does it sit around? If you were in manufacturing, this would be called takt time. It's a real term. The problem is, right? The problem is that it is, it's really difficult to actually measure in pretty much any scenario unless you need tooling to do it, especially in software, and you need a level of observation that I think is borders on that borders on evil. And the amount of effort, if you're not using something that monitors individuals to get that, is probably too much overhead. But here's what I'd like you to take away from this idea of flow efficiency, right? We work on something, it sits around waiting for the next step. I write some code, and then I really need to have somebody do a code review on it. I have to get my friend Andrew, who's 2 desks down, but he's busy and he'll get to it this afternoon. It's sitting around for that time between when I worked on it and when he, finally code reviewed it. And then I went home overnight and I did something else in the morning. You see how it snowballs. Dr. Kirsten and his organization actually has done some hardcore work. And it dovetails into work that Capers Jones did back in the 1990s. Basically, it boiled down to flow efficiency. The amount of time stuff is actually happening and the amount of time that it's sitting around is flow efficiency for software work is, well, it's crap, right? It's really low. Kirsten would suggest that if you're reporting anything over 30% efficiency, then he would have his eyes on you. It's really a relatively suspect problem. Great metric. The thing to remember is out of this, it's very hard, right? I think it's really good, even at a macro level, to look at it, if you can, at a value stream level. Get the value streams a little while later, mention that again. But I think it's really helpful to finding bottlenecks and reducing efficiency. Recognize that, especially at a value chain level, doing a modification that makes a step in the middle more efficient probably won't translate to the end. Might make that that little piece happy, but if it doesn't create more value out of the end of the big process, well, maybe it was a waste of time. What do you think happens when a team or a person is starved for work? And that's, this whole flow efficiency thing is another way of thinking about it, is that if things are sitting because somebody else needs to get something done, you're waiting around, what do? You probably start something else. You start to build more flow load, or you just say yes to the first thing that happens, because none of us probably don't want to be busy. We're all problem solvers, so we like to go and work on solving problems. We do something else, right? We do something else that increases flow load. Flow load increases, messes with our flow distribution. More flow load reduces our ability to actually get stuff done. So it just sort of snowballs down the list. Escape rate is, I think, if you're doing Scrum or any other time-boxed method, I would suggest that escape rate, number of stories, or product backlog items, or whatever the term, that are not done, quote unquote, potentially deployable, done enough to get it into a product backlog kind of thing at the end of the sprint. Things that you said you were going to do that aren't done, that's escape rate. And that number probably will never be purely zero, but it shouldn't be approaching a number with multiple digits. Again, why is that important? the idea, right? The idea of this escape rate is to monitor and to understand why suddenly, you look at the example here, right? There are a couple of examples. In sprint 14, this sprint team, the scrum team, actually had 20% of their product backlog items didn't complete. You know, what went on there? That's a great lead into a retrospective. What is it that happened? I mean, obviously, we can talk about breaking work down and hey, we took on too much. We knew we took on too much. Those sorts of things. It could also be that work was injected that took control, right? That you didn't control work entry. Things happen. I have a brother who runs a company in Louisiana that builds custom homes. And while they're not doing Scrum per se, they do track work items, and they have specific periods of time. People, commit to getting pieces of work done, and they monitor that. They monitor that because, very frankly, if one of the stories over Thanksgiving that he told was that he had a drywall crew that had completed the stuff that they needed to do at one house. They were then going to roll onto another house. And if you ever built a house or had work done, good drywallers are not a dime a dozen. So they were about to roll to the next house but that house, the framers hadn't completed the parts that they had committed to, for whatever reason, right? So all of that then that snowballed down. Houses were late, people, so storage escape rate goes back to that whole idea of predictability. Predictability and trust are really just highly intertwined. If you're not predictable, people will have a problem with trust. Now, I did mention once upon a time I lived in Louisiana. I wasn't born there, but I did live there, went to school there. So I wanted to add a little bit of LAGNIAPPE. LAGNIAPPE is sort of that baker's dozen. Go and buy 12 cookies in Baton Rouge at a local baker, and you'll probably end up with 13 in there because that's just the way that one works. It's LAGNIAPPE. That LAGNIAPPE that I wanted to add to this is the whole idea of neglected WIP. And again, I did foreshadow this. The idea of any word that, any phrase that begins with neglected, probably not good. Well, it isn't good. So all of us probably have too much on our to-do list. We've started too many things and we're juggling them, right? I'll work on this for a little while, put it down, I'll work on this for a little while. I'll put on this a little while, I'll put on this a little while. I had to jump between two sprint planning meetings this morning. Jump between one. So one of them actually did get sort of neglected. Neglected work is the work we commit to delivering that sits in progress, while in progress is that big technical definition. I might have put it on hold, but it's still there. It's still there. And while other work gets worked on. Well, simple. There's actually a way of deriving that. And that's actually the real cool thing about this. We can use Little's Law. Again, we won't dive into Little's Law, but Little's Law basically is a relatively simple queuing theory. Has some caveats around it, but it shows the connection between arrival rate, average arrival rate, and average length of time in the queue, and the average departure rate. So there is a relationship between those kinds of things. And again, it's math, it's technical. I can put into some articles on that. It's great stuff, but very frankly, if we know that, right? If we know, we look at Little's Law, it can help us get a handle on a rough number of things that, based on the capacity of the team, the capacity of the organization, that we should be doing at any one time. Anything over that means that we have some amount of neglected WIP. We want to drive that amount of neglected WIP, that percentage, down as far as we can. Probably always be some. So I'm not gonna scream and yell and say, hey, you have to, yeah, that should be zero. It's a prediction anyway, right? So there's some degree of gray there. But if it's significantly over that predicted line, you probably have stuff sitting around. You probably have taken, worked in, said, well, I don't really know when it's going to be done, but I'll start working on it. And then when they turn their back, they pick it up. You pick something else up. I'll start working on this. And nobody knows when you're going to deliver. Or worse yet, you actually tell them when you're going to deliver, and then you stay up all night trying to finish it. I remember the last time I stayed up 24 hours coding and testing stuff, and yeah, that probably wasn't the best code I've ever written in my life. This is actually a really powerful idea. And you can do all of this stuff, right? You can do all of this stuff yourself. There are tools, and here's an example of one tool that does all of this kind of stuff. There are others. I have a friend who wrote did some things in Confluence, brought stuff in from Jira, brought things in from Actionable Agile, and combined them up into a cool dashboard. Again, none of this stuff is rocket science. It's excruciatingly powerful, right? It is excruciatingly powerful. It is powerful at all levels of the organization. Very simple organizational model. The big organizational, the executive level kind of things, the mushy middle. You never know where executive ends, and team level stuff and all the people in there. Call that mushy middle. Highly important kind of thing, but it is sort of mushy in terms of where you would draw that line. And then team level stuff. Again, I think all of these, at the org level and sort of the senior manager kind of level, understanding and using this stuff to understanding whether or not, here's what our intent is, here's whether or not we're following our intent. Sort of dashboard, flow distribution leads you to that. Flow load can be boiled up and let you look at whether or not your intent is actually being translated into the actions at a team level. And this is, that top level and that high level of mushy middle, I think you almost need to wrestle with the idea of value stream management, value chain management, product kind of views. At the team level, this stuff can actually be used in planning. It can be used to communicate with your stakeholders. It can be used for you to actually look at your performance and decide whether or not you need to improve. Where are opportunities? Escape rate, flow load, flow velocity, all make good dashboard metrics in terms of, there are some that are more, back of the pack kind of stuff. At the middle level, the whole idea of flow efficiency, that's pretty rear view mirror. It's what happened in the past kind of stuff. To an extent, flow load is sort of rear view mirror. Here's what the teams are doing. You can't really affect that. You could going forward, but it's going to be a while. So a little bit different terms of perspectives as you drill down, right? As you drill down, these 5, 6, 7, depending on how many you use, are really powerful mechanism to link what's actually happening to what value is being delivered. all set, right? All set. I would say flow is a big deal. But context does matter. For example, if overhead is killing you, if you're looking at your overhead, then maybe you need to measure something else for some period of time. Things like burn rate make a ton of sense. But to be honest with you, I do that until I fixed it. And stop doing it. I like the DevOps metrics, the DORA metrics, but I don't know that they have value over time. They're a good point in time kind of thing, and they don't really necessarily connect to value. They're a good vision in on something, and then I'd say they struggle after that. Flow metrics, I think they're actually metrics that matter.
Well, we did have a comment. Not sure if you saw it. I found features tend to be overclaimed and defects/debt tend to be undercounted because enhancements, supposedly features, are mainly due to missed and misunderstood.
Yeah, I can buy that. I think that's probably a degree of weakness there. I tend to see things being over and undercounted when there's a little bit of pecuniary kind of things going on. So yeah, now that's a possibility, but at least it starts the right kinds of conversations.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you, Tom. We did have a question pop up.
Yep.
Can you explain again if variability in size of things being measured matters?
So yes, it does matter. It does matter, but it matters far less than I think we think it matters. Again, if you're focusing on refining the work, breaking it down, and you have some degree of limits, that causes the amount of variability to reduce. If it's wide open and a feature isn't broken down into things, and you have features and they're never broken down and defects, then I think that you're going to have trouble with this kinds of stuff. So I do think it matters. If you're breaking it down in terms of a relatively consistent fashion, it doesn't matter as much as you think. So I think you can get away with it. If you look at the math, so those books down there are math, there would probably be some caveat in here in the math that said they should be exactly the same size. And again, I think there is some degree of variability. I think if you control the variability, it doesn't matter.
Okay, great. Thank you.
By the way, I'd be happy to continue that discussion. That's a fun discussion.
Tom, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Susan.